Hi, I'm William McGeveran, Dean of the University of Minnesota Law School and William S. Pattee Professor of Law. Welcome to our new podcast, Minnesota Law Now. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Minnesota Law Now. It's a new podcast from the University of Minnesota Law School, where we'll be asking members of our distinguished faculty to sit down in conversation. They're going to discuss some of the most urgent legal and social issues of our time. I'm William McGeveran. I'm the Dean of the Law School and the William S. Pattee Professor of Law. Well, few topics in American law feel more urgent or more contested than the scope of presidential power today. From executive orders and emergency declarations to immigration enforcement, national security, limits imposed by Congress and the courts, the presidency, of course, sits at the center of some of the most consequential legal debates of our time. Presidents sign executive orders, they declare emergencies, they direct agencies, they shape national policy overnight. How much of that power is constitutional, and where are those limits? Today, we're talking about the law of presidential power, what a president can do alone, what Congress and the courts do when they step in, and how crises, whether national security threats or political gridlock, test the system. I'm joined by two of my extraordinary Minnesota law colleagues, Professor Nick Bednar, class of 2016 from Minnesota Law, who studies administrative agencies and executive control, and Professor Alan Rozenshtein, an expert in constitutional and national security law. Nick, Alan, thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for it.
So I want to begin by asking both of you, just broadly speaking, what people are talking about when they talk about presidential power in legal terms. Where does it come from, and what does the term mean in law? Nick, how would you answer that?
So I think there are really two sources of presidential power that most people are thinking about when we use that phrase. So the first is the Constitution itself. And so Article 2 of the Constitution defines the powers of the president and says what the enumerated powers of the president are. But Article 2 itself is pretty vague. It has some specific powers, but mostly it just describes the executive power as being vested in the president. And so a lot of times when people are talking about presidential power, what they're actually talking about is statutory authority possessed by the executive branch and what the executive branch is able to do as a result of the laws passed by Congress.
So the Constitution is the starting point, but the statutes add so much more. I want to begin by talking about one place where presidential power lives day to day in the federal agencies that actually carry out the president's agenda. Nick, so much of the president's power flows through those agencies. So how does control over that apparatus of administrative state translate into political real-world authority?
Yeah, so the vast majority of laws in the United States are implemented by the executive branch. Through the 2.8 million people who work for that branch. And so when we're talking about presidential power, what we're often talking about is the president's ability to direct the people in those agencies. So we're talking about things as, broad as the Environmental Protection Agency passing regulations that might limit carbon emissions for a new industry. We're talking about things as simple as the U.S. Postal Service choosing to deliver mail down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So the way that the president is able to direct and control the people within the executive branch and how they choose to do their jobs shapes a lot of presidential power and what law actually looks like for the United States and how the public experiences it.
Sure. I don't know how simple it is to deliver mail to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, but I take your point.
So you fun
First,
fact.
get a donkey.
So fun fact, the bottom of the Grand Canyon is the only place where the U.S. Postal Service still uses donkeys. It uses a mule train.
You weren't joking.
No.
That's how you get to the bottom of the Grand Canyon.
They also use hovercrafts. So
it takes a lot to get the mail there on time, I guess. What about when they say it's an independent agency? We've been seeing so much, especially with the recent litigation about the Federal Reserve membership, the Federal Trade Commission. How does that fit into the picture? How
Yeah.
independent really are they from the president?
Yeah, so independent agencies, there's a variation of degree into how independent these agencies are. We can start with kind of the agencies that most people think of that are like controlled pretty heavily by the president. So we can think of something like the Department of State or the Department of Justice. These are headed by a single presidential appointee who kind of exercises hierarchical authority. We then have some agencies that are outside that traditional cabinet structure. And they have various structures that make them more or less independent from the president. So, for example, you brought up the Federal Reserve. Well, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve is governed by multiple members who are appointed from different parties and who enjoy removal protections. And often when we're talking about independent agencies in the legal context, we're talking about those agencies where their appointees enjoy removal protections. Now, how independent are those appointees actually from the president? It's changing over time very rapidly. The Supreme Court has been very active in kind of curbing Congress's authority to restrict removal of these appointees. There's a case before the U.S. Supreme Court right now, Trump v. Slaughter, that'll decide whether these removal protections are constitutional for members of the Federal Trade Commission. Empirically, we know from political science that even before these decisions, however, presidents exercise quite a bit of control over these agencies. In terms of day-to-day policymaking, they were usually able to get what they wanted out of these agencies without too much difficulty.
Sure. So, I mean, you mentioned how active the Supreme Court has been in that area of removal power in independent agencies. They've been active all over the place. There's been shifts to the non-delegation doctrine, the abandonment of the Chevron case that had deference. Put together, how are all those shifts changing the balance of power between Congress, agencies, and president?
Yeah, so I think, the Supreme Court is operating under a theory where what it wants to do is it wants to incentivize Congress to write clearer laws that better guide executive discretion. And so one way to interpret these shifts is the Supreme Court really trying to restore power to Congress to engage in lawmaking. Now, for example, take the Chevron case, right? So Chevron was this case that was decided in 1984 that stood for the proposition that a federal court should defer to an executive branch agencies about what the law means, so long as its interpretation is reasonable and the statute's ambiguous. A lot of people think this case provided agencies with considerable policymaking authority, and in fact it did. Recently, within the last 2 years, the Supreme Court has gotten rid of that doctrine and said, actually, courts are going to be the ones to say what the best meaning of the law is. And so we've seen the court kind of reclaim some of its own authority to decide what the law is and take some of that policymaking authority away from the executive branch in hopes that Congress will reclaim it. Now, practically, we don't wholly know yet what the consequence of this is going to be. One potential result is Congress actually chooses to legislate more often and more clearly. Another potential option is that courts don't have the expertise that executive agencies do, and so they just continue to sort of defer to these agencies.
Sure. Well, I guess that's one of the many areas we're going to be seeing how it plays out over the next coming years. It's going to keep you busy as a scholar for years to come.
Yes.
And that's just in the ordinary routine governance that happens in the everyday sense through agencies. Then there's the issue of emergencies of one kind or another, and that can be an even greater stress test for these constitutional boundaries. Alan, obviously national security, an area where you have expertise, is often one of the places that presidents will cite to claim their strongest powers. What is it about that domain that gives so much latitude and deference to the president?
Sure. So there's a practical answer, then there's a legal answer. So the practical answer is just that national security is both high stakes, it's very fast, and it needs single command. And so when you combine all of those things together, it's natural that the president, the chief executive, the commander in chief, is always going to have a lot of powers there. The legal answer is that both the Constitution, under at least some readings, and in particular statute, give the president a whole host of emergency powers. So let's just stick to the national security context for a second. So the Article 2 makes the president the commander in chief. As Nick pointed out, Article 2 is unfortunately pretty vague as to what all of that means. But one thing that's been at least understood, at least all the way back to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, and you probably find some of this stuff with even someone like George Washington back when he was dealing with some domestic disturbances at the beginning of the Republic, is that, for example, if the nation is attacked, then the president has an inherent ability, without waiting for congressional authorization, without waiting for Congress to declare war, which is one of Congress's powers in the Constitution, to go and deal with that threat. And various presidents have, over American history, made more or less aggressive interpretations of their inherent emergency powers under Article 2. These days, however, when presidents cite emergency powers, they're not usually relying on the Constitution alone. Again, part of this is for legal reasons. There's a famous case from the Korean War that everyone learns in constitutional law class called Youngstown, which sets out this idea that when the president is acting against Congress, he is acting at the quote-unquote lowest ebb of his powers, and he doesn't always lose, but he frequently loses. So when at all possible, the president would like to act with Congress. And Congress has obliged, especially since World War II. Congress has in statute, written a bunch of emergency authorizations that allow the president to first declare an emergency and then to exercise powers that the president wouldn't otherwise have access to absent those powers.
For example, we've heard about emergencies in the context of tariffs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, there's a whole set of emergencies regarding economic trade control. So there's this law called the International Economic Emergencies Powers Act, IEPA, which allows the president during emergencies, national security emergencies, to, for example, restrict imports as well as impose sanctions on various countries. Now, this and other emergencies are almost by their definition meant to be somewhat temporary. That's what makes it an emergency and not the normal course of business. And in fact, many of these emergencies are temporary. Some of them, however, have lasted for quite some time.
Yeah.
Two in particular come to mind. One is the authorization for use of military force, which is basically the modern post-World War II way that Congress declares war. And this was after 9/11, when Congress gave the president the authority to go after al-Qaeda and associated forces, basically legal authorization for the wars in Afghanistan. That authorization is still in effect 25 years later, or almost 25 years later, and is still being used by the president. And then IEPA, which I mentioned earlier, is also still being used. So, for example, sanctions against Iran go all the way back to the Iran hostage crisis during the Carter administration. Just doing some quick math, that's almost 50 years now.
Yeah.
And so that is an ongoing emergency. So what you see is that because of a combination of, I think, legitimate reasons to give the president some flexibility, but then also the kind of secular increase in presidential power, especially in the post-war period, and the concomitant unwillingness of Congress to take any of that really power back, you're seeing a president that just has more and more and more power, which certainly has a variety of implications that we can talk about.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the checks that there are. You've mentioned a few. Both of you have. The Congress has various tools. You mentioned Youngstown and the ways in which the court can cause constraint. Nick, you mentioned the effect of the the overruling of Chevron being a return to more power of the court potentially. What do you see as the most important of those kind of checks and those actors out there? There's Congress, there's the courts, there's other, there's the agencies themselves. Where are those checks most likely to be working now? So watch, they both laugh. That's a bad sign.
Where are they working, Nick? Please tell us.
I said where they're most likely to work. As you look forward to saying who using what tools are causing constraint on this expansion of presidential authority, where's it going to come from?
Yeah. So, I think just to kind of tee it off as to why Alan and I are both laughing, the founders had this vision of the Constitution that was very much separation of powers, right? Mm-hmm. Congress was going to check the president was going to check Congress, the court was going to check both of them, right? And we had this nice kind of Schoolhouse Rock triangle of the way.
Yep.
Yeah, the little triangle.
I have images of the movie Election, where Matthew Broderick is up at the board year after year drawing that triangle for his high school civics classes.
I watched that movie for the first time this week.
It's a good movie.
Yeah. So the reality of kind of modern politics is we really live in a separation of parties system as opposed to a separation of power system. So, it's hard to say exactly who's going to provide the check because it kind of depends on who controls the institution at any given moment. I think even though, we have today, Congress is controlled by a Republican majority and we have a Republican president in the White House, that might lead you to believe there are no checks. We still see some checks, but they're more often informal soft power sources.
Sure.
So examples of this are spending powers, right? Mm-hmm. The president proposes a budget, Congress can reduce the size of that budget. Mm-hmm. In order to pass the budget, the parties often have to negotiate with one another. A good example of this is when we came out of the November shutdown, one of the things that was agreed to end the shutdown was a moratorium on reducing the size of the federal workforce. And so that was in effect till January 31st. It's been extended to February 13th. But we have, these more informal kind of infrequent checks that occur through investigations and appropriations as opposed to kind of what the founders may have intended with the separation of powers.
Well, so Alan, what about courts as a part of that picture, though? So if we have separation of parties and you've got a judicial system alongside that, where does that come in terms of checking the executive authority?
Yeah, so courts obviously have a role to play, and they do frequently check the president, as they have been doing, I think surprising amount of vigor, at least at the lower court levels in this administration. But there are, I think, at least two reasons to be skeptical that courts are going to be particularly effective. One is the political dimension. So obviously one of the sort of third rails of debate in constitutional law is the extent to which the courts, and in particular the Supreme Court, is a apolitical legal institution or more of a political super legislature. And if it's the latter, then it's going to be subject to a lot of the same political pathologies that Nick pointed out takes place with Congress. I tend to think that the answer is usually somewhere in between, but we should not be super surprised that in a court where 6 out of the 3 justices were appointed by members of the president's party, that the president would do, let's say, better with that court than if the roles were reversed. And I don't think you need to take a particularly cynical, even partisan view of the court for this. You can just say, well, there's a reason they were selected. They were, this such and such justice was selected because his or her views were concordant with the views of the person that appointed.
People pick judges that they think are good judges based on what they think is the right kind of judging to do.
And that's kind of the point, right? I mean, that's kind of the reason, and that's in some sense a good thing because it allows some democratic check. So again, in a situation now where I think you can say that all 3 branches of government are in some way controlled by the Republican Party, you're going to have less checking than were that to be reversed. The second reason is more of an institutional reason, which is that at least in some domains, and here national security is the big one, courts are just not very well positioned to check the presidency. So there is the way this is legally expressed is with the idea of what's called the political question doctrine, the idea that there are some issues that are so outside the court's competency and where it would be such a potential problem for the courts to come in and, for example, start countermanding the president's decisions, whether it's to bomb this or that country, that the courts say, we're not going to get involved in those debates. Not because we think the president is allowed to do this, but because we're actually not going to pass judgment on this. This is just outside of our jurisdiction. And there are all sorts of debates about that. If I may, though, just go back to your question and just to maybe challenge the premise just a little bit.
Please.
I think at the end of the day, the most effective checks to all of this is actually not a legal check at all. It's the political process.
Right. I was going to ask about that exact question. So go ahead and answer that question.
Sure. So elections have consequences, right? And elections should have consequences. And in a very narrowly and unfortunately somewhat bitterly divided country like ours, those consequences will be quite substantial. And so, if you don't want a president who goes off the rails using emergency powers, At the end of the day, there's only so much that the institutions can do. They can shape that emergency power exercise. They can check it here or there. But at some point, the people have to, through their electoral choices, say, we do like this or we don't like this. And I think that's something that law professors, legal academics are sometimes somewhat uncomfortable with, because those are fundamentally not legal answers, right? Those are political answers, and in some ways sort of outside our zone of competence. You know, we're just umpires, right? But at the end of the day, the audience has to show up.
Right. And is, on some level, at least indirectly, choosing some of those umpires.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Nick, so much of this is informal. Norms, political control, some of the soft power you referred to, some of the kind of judicial shaping that Alan referred to. Is that typical of the way that we've had constitutional division of power, separation of powers throughout history here? Are we in a time when things are more informal, more based on norms, or is this the norm?
I mean, I think to some degree it's the norm that presidents have always had a fair amount of discretion, and the use of that discretion has been governed by some amount of norms shared among people who held the highest office about how the government should run. A good example of this is we're seeing a lot of, shaking up of the civil service. The Trump administration has been very active in removing federal employees and changing hiring policy. And there's a lot of questions about how legal that is. A lot of the president's authority to do this dates back to civil service laws that predate the modern civil service and are still on the books. And the reason presidents haven't thought to use these laws in the way the Trump administration is doing so is simply because presidents had a general understanding of norms that it was a good idea to have a functioning federal workforce. You wanted people who could implement your agenda. And now presidents pushed at the boundaries of that, right? The Reagan administration was very active in reducing the size of certain agencies like EPA. The Clinton administration had some of the largest reductions in force in history. But at the same time, there was kind of an understanding that at the end of the day, government still needed to function. And so I think a lot of law has been governed by an understanding of what these norms are, and we've just played within kind of the boundaries we thought were shaped by those norms. And we're seeing the limits of law at this moment as those norms start to erode.
Well, so I want to do a little bit of a pivot here and look towards the future. We've talked a lot about history and precedent. We've talked a lot about structure that's been in place for decades and in some cases centuries. Let's look a little bit towards the future and where these debates about executive power might be going. And in particular, so many things are happening, right? We've referred to at least a dozen different areas where there's debate and conflict and litigation about some of the exercises of presidential powers. What are the areas of presidential action that you're looking at the most that you think are most important for triggering these fights and for potentially yielding any kind of important changes in the balance of power and the separation of powers?
I mean,
go ahead, Nick.
So there are three I think are really big. I unfortunately have spent the last month reading every brief that the Trump administration has filed in the district courts defending presidential action, which is not good for one's mental health. But why is it not? You learn that creative lawyering is sometimes very scary.
Okay.
But I think there are three recurring themes that I am seeing.
Okay.
The first is related to something known as unitary executive theory. Unitary executive theory is the idea that the president needs control over all subordinates within the executive branch because the president is the source of executive power. So thinking about what constitutional fights we want to be looking at, we want to be watching how the Supreme Court decides Trump v. Slaughter and whether we see it expanding the president's ability to control.
And that's the FTC case.
This is the FTC case. Expanding the president's control over these individuals, or whether it's going to kind of draw a line in the sand and say, this is where it stops. Other one we want to be watching is presidential control over spending. So during the shutdown, the Trump administration really pushed the boundaries of what was viewed as permissible spending during a shutdown. The Trump administration has also made claims that the president has an inherent Article 2 authority to engage in some degree of impoundment, that is, withholding spending certain funds.
Right. The impoundment is the money that the Congress puts in the Appropriations Act, spend this, and then the president wants to not spend that.
Right. And so we saw a lot of this very early on in the Trump administration with pausing grants. The third thing is more sort of in Allen's area, but the scope of what the president thinks the foreign affairs power is.
Sure.
So the president has argued that foreign affairs means he can end refugee admissions to the United States, that he can abolish whole agencies like the U.S. Agency for International Development, and even the foreign affairs power is what is being used in litigation to argue that demolishing the East Wing of the White House was permissible.
Foreign affairs, okay. It's creative lawyering.
You have to host diplomats in the ballroom.
This is the argument.
That's the argument. Exactly. Alan, is that a good list? Is there more to add to it?
No, I think that's the great list. I'll answer, I think, the question somewhat differently, and I'll say there's two things that I'm thinking about, neither of which are focused on sort of the law necessarily of executive power, though Nick did a great job outlining the major issues there. So the first is what the next president will do. So this administration will run out the clock and it will be what it is. Fair enough.
Yep.
But 2020
elections have consequences.
Yeah, elections have consequences. But I think what will be more important actually for the long term is not so much what Trump does for the rest of his term, but what happens in 2028. So obviously, if let's say a Republican, let's say it's J.D. Vance becomes president, I would expect a lot of this to continue. The really interesting question to me is what happens if a Democrat wins in 2028 and it's President Newsom or President AOC or Shapiro or Buttigieg or whoever it is. Will they use it as an opportunity to say, man, it was a rough 4 years, we should really go back to a more constrained, internally checked presidency? Or has this period been so radicalizing for the Democrats that they'll say, we're done, right? We're done unilaterally disarming. If we get no credit for this when we do it, it just limits our policy space. And then when the Republicans take control, and if that's the case, and it's an understandable reaction, though probably not one that's best for the long-term health of the American democratic experiment, then that raises real concerns about whether the separation of powers can endure. So that's kind of political answer. The other thing that I'm interested in on a somewhat longer time scale is the technological question of what the president can do. So when I'm not studying executive power, I study technology regulation and in particular AI. And one thing that's been interesting over the last 6 months is thinking how those two things converge. Yeah. Because one thing that we're seeing is the rapid acceleration of these AI systems, ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, that we're all using. They're not just sort of useful for chatting with. They can themselves be very effective agents in running complex organizations, right? At the end of the day, and I remember this when I was a junior policy attorney in the Department of Justice before coming to Minnesota, fundamentally what the government does is it takes Word documents and turns them into other Word documents, and then sends them around through email. You can think of it that way. Now, obviously, that's an extremely reductive way of thinking about it, but that is a lot of what the executive branch does. So you imagine a world in which the president has access to these tools, these agents that are tuned on the president's preferences, that are very smart, very effective, and that can operate at all levels of the bureaucracy. Suddenly, these really interesting legal debates that Nick and I might have about what's the appropriate scope of the removal power, in some sense, we can actually finally test the reality of those. Because now this question of, even under the most muscular version of the unitary executive theory, how could a president really ever run a 2.8 million person bureaucracy? Well, now the president actually can.
Executive power by bot.
Exactly. And so in a world where you can actually effectuate that, what does executive power look like? And I think it looks a lot stronger. And so I don't really see for the next 5, 10, 15 years any real diminution in executive power. And I think that raises real concerns about at least the current state of our constitutional experiment.
Okay. So while we're talking about the future, and we're almost out of time together, but I want to give you each a magic wand, a legal magic wand, and ask you what's the one change or reform or structural alteration or amendment to the Constitution or new doctrine from the court. What's the one thing that you would most like to see in this area of executive power occur Nick?
I'd enact a constitutional amendment that separates the administrative state and basically codifies Congress's ability to delegate power to it and ensures protection of the employees who implement the law.
Does that make them another branch or just a better regulated part of the executive branch by the legislature?
I think you could do it either way. People have proposed it either way. But, I think at the end of the day, you're going to need an administrative state headed by someone. It makes sense that it's headed by the president, but that state needs more protections than it has right now.
Okay. Alan, what's your one magical change?
I think it's pretty clear that we should be a parliamentary system.
That's a big magical
I mean,
change.
I was gonna say what Nick said, and then I was gonna say what Nick said, and then he took it from me.
Okay. I mean, you have people in some parliamentary democracies in Europe constantly saying that they think that they should be more, Americanized in some ways. So
I think they are incorrect.
Okay.
There is a reason. There is a reason why whenever American political scientists, or whenever America, for example, engages in nation building, it does not suggest strong presidential systems, because those just tend to over time box out the legislature and arrogate more and more power to the presidency. It was an interesting experiment, but
you're using the past tense, Alan.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I have this last year I have lost my chill, for lack of a better way of describing it. But I think we probably do better with a parliamentary system. But since we're not going to do that, yes, I think that the court really lightening up on the unitary executive theory and allowing and recognizing that there is such a thing as internal separation of powers, right? That bureaucratic resistance and inertia and slack, these are not necessarily bugs. They are sometimes features of the system. That would be particularly helpful. I mean, again, just going back to that previous point about what happens in a world of technologically mediated presidential power, I think that just raises the stakes, right? When the president now has an army of agents that can do all this, you need even more independence within the bureaucracy.
Great. So I have one last question. What would the founders think of where we're at right now, Nick?
I think the founders would enter this room and look at the television and be like, what the hell is this?
Fair point. And they'd probably be drawn by your glasses too. No, in seriousness, what would they consider this, what they might have expected to happen?
I think there's going to be disagreement among legal scholars as to whether this system we have is moving towards more of what the founders intended. I think if you zoom out and you look at the last year and how presidential power has been used, you don't see a system of separation of powers. I think you see a system where power has been consolidated within the president, and the president no longer feels constrained by the systems that the founders put in place. So we can think just very briefly to Judge Schiltz's order
here in Minnesota, the order about the previous court orders that had not been obeyed by the administration.
Right. So Judge Schiltz finds that there are 74 cases in the month of January alone where Immigration and Customs Enforcement hasn't complied with executive orders. And that suggests something's breaking.
I'm sorry, with judicial orders,
With
right?
judicial orders, yes. And that suggests something's not constraining the president, where the founders would have thought that constraint was available.
All right, Alan, you get the last word. Do you have a sense that that's what the founders would think?
I don't think they'd be happy about what they're seeing, and I think there's two things in particular. One, to Nick's point earlier in the conversation about how instead of a separation of power system, we're in a separation of party system. I think this is one thing that they'd be horrified by. I think one thing that's notable about the founders is that they did not predict how quickly the American system would fracture on this party basis. And the other thing I think they would be pretty horrified by, frankly, just the lack of civic virtue in the executive branch. One thing that's really notable, and I think goes a long way to explaining why Article 2 is as sketchy as it is because in some sense, it's always hardest to articulate what exactly the president can do because it's the kind of in some sense, it's the most vague set of authorities and it's hardest to predict.
It's all the rest of the stuff.
Exactly. Kind of. And so the reason that Article 2 was left so vague, and there are actually statements from some of the framers at the Constitutional Convention was, well, we all know that George Washington is going to be the first president. So we actually don't have to worry so much about Article 2 because he'll figure it out and we trust him, right? He is our Cincinnatus, right? He is our great kind of Roman-like statesman. We've come a long way from George Washington. And I suspect that if the framers saw the sorts of people that are now often being elevated to high office, they would have a lot of skepticism that our system can endure, because even more than they were lawyers and political scientists, these were moral philosophers. And they took this idea of you need morality and virtue very seriously. And that's something that sadly we have less of today than I think we need.
Well, Nick and Alan, thanks for adding so much context and richness to this topic, which of course is permeating every aspect of public life today. If you want to explore these issues further, you can learn more about our faculty and courses at Minnesota Law. Thanks so much for listening.